Chris, do you want to start us off and kind of talk through your slides, and then I'm going to come back with some questions from Slido, and we can go from there.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll get through some of this and then pepper away with questions. So thank you, Jonathan, and thank you for the Testing Festival for having me today and allowing me to talk. For those of you in later time zones, I pray I don't put you to sleep, but if I do, hopefully I'm better than a warm glass of milk. So I want to talk to you today about our Applitools story. I know Angie's going to talk to you about some amazing things tomorrow, but I wanted to get a chance to talk to you as a customer. Just a tiny bit about me. I've been doing some form of quality assurance for the past 15 years, with the majority in functional test automation. Lately, I've been working with the Micro Focus products. In fact, the Applitools integrations that you're going to see are in conjunction with Micro Focus. As Jonathan mentioned, I've been a speaker at a variety of things, and I just really absolutely adore providing benefits back to the community. So I'm going to dive into the content and then allow plenty of room for any questions that might come about. So the current project that we're working on things with Applitools is mobile testing. And I titled this slide Mobile Testing Woes because mobile testings are all about woes. So if we start thinking about it, we have a lot of functional testing, but then there's all kinds of extra stuff that comes about. We have to validate all the UX stuff. And I'm going to call things a lot of stuff because I don't proclaim to be an expert with things like UX and UX design. I can just test what they design. We validate layout. We have to validate all the pretty things, and I like to call it that because so many times, and rightfully so, they spend all this time, coming up with these icons, and they want them lined up, and they want to make sure that everything looks and feels wonderful for the end users, and that's incredibly key for everyone. So we have all this stuff, and it's like, holy cow, what are we supposed to do? And we could have this little freak out moment. Well, let's talk about through some of the options that we have to deal with that bit of panic that we might have. So what are our options? So I'd like to remind us all that we always have the option to do nothing. It's not a good option, but there's always that option to do nothing. We're not going to talk about that, obviously. We could say, well, we're not going to validate those. We're just going to validate functional things and let somebody else do it, which is perfectly fine. That's not what we're going to talk about today. We can say script all the things. That could be quite perplexing, but maybe we can find a better option. Before we find a better option, let's look at what does script all the things actually mean. So here's a screenshot from our mobile app today. It's the first part of registration where an individual would come in and identify themselves as a member so they can register and have their mobile app with their benefits claims and other wonderful things that they have. So what does this mean? We got maybe this little progress bar up top. That's part of the things. Creating an account, a bunch of form fields, and then because of the user design of it all, with those form fields comes style to those form fields. Checkbox, we got some verbiage, and then we have a bunch of links that we can act upon. That's one screen with all this stuff to validate, not including the functionality of it, where we have to make sure that date of birth takes a date, that email address, we can't just plunk in something that just says Jim. No, it's got to be jim@provider.com or .org or whatever it might be, a proper phone number. So in addition to all of the functional things and validations of the form, we have stylistic things. What could possibly be a better option? Well, Applitools happen to be that better option for us. So let's take a look at that same thing with this option. So same screen, how do we validate this? One simple call to the eyes library. That's all we have to do. It's incredibly easy. We make this call and this is validated. Talk a little bit about how this is validated in a moment before we dive into it. We looked at a lot of different options, and that former option of validating all those various things, including functionality, was just a bit much. Could we do it? Absolutely. Is it worth our time and effort? I would say the answer was no. So how do I see Applitools? Super simple. Let's go back to childhood. I think of Sesame Street. I think of those, which one of these things is not like the other episodes? And Cookie Monster seems a little bit perplexed here. That plate there that has 3 cookies. If we were to send those 4 plates of cookies to Applitools, Applitools would tell us, it's a plate that has extra cookies. Did you mean for it to have extra cookies? I don't know. Let's find out. Now, I think it's worth taking a brief moment looking back. So we didn't just say, ooh, Applitools is new and shiny, we're just going to start using it. We did take a POC. And I'm taking this brief pause looking at our POC just because for anyone interested in the product, I don't want anyone to say, oh, I'm going to get it just because somebody else says it's the right way to do it. It's a way to do things. Is it the right way for us? Yes, yes it is. But what were some of the things that we put into consideration before we knew it was the right way? So we had these 8 items that we took as criteria for verifying it. And what you can do if you don't want to go to your developer and ask them to make a whole bunch of changes, or if you don't want to have to go digging through your defect log and find images of what went wrong or what went right with the rendering of our applications. What I did is before we did the eyes check, we injected JavaScript into the pages, so for the websites that we test, to make things happen. Obviously, you can manipulate a page with JavaScript, and that's what we did. So the 8 things we did is we took the logo shift. Our branding is very important to us. We want to make sure that our branding is accurate and that the logo is in the right size in the right place. Our logo has red in a good portion of it. We want to make sure that that red is not red on red because it's going to look silly. We want to make sure it's in the right context. Menu bars. Menu bars can break all the time. Maybe text blows outside of the menu bar. Maybe when you open up a menu, it's not going to show up just right. Or maybe the background doesn't show up when you open it. There's so many different things that can go visually wrong with a menu. Column changes. So that's where, maybe we had columns defined in a certain way and something changed unexpectedly to break that. Textual blowout. So you have the body of your page where there's content. What happens if all of a sudden that blows out and it's now over maybe some ads or call to actions or advertisements or other things? You want to have it clean and concise. You can check for that. We wanted to make sure that as content was added to our site, it wouldn't cause some unexpected false negatives. So we didn't want it to start flagging things saying, well, you added content. Well, I found that you added content, yay. But we wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to fail on us. Hidden or missing buttons. This is a great conversation for anything that's in the realm of computer vision, anything that actually looks at that rendered UI that the members or customers are using. So many times it's incredibly possible to have it where your interfaces have images that show up in the background, and we don't want that. Things like Selenium and other drivers that you have for your browsers can certainly still interact with those buttons, but can your users? The user can't see a button. Does it exist? Well, to the end user, it doesn't, and we can help definitely look for those things. In your scripts, you can make it so that a button is hidden, where in a WebDriver, you could still interact with it, but certainly your end user couldn't, and that's something you want to check for. Font size is another thing that can keep your user experience teams and those designers quite happy to validate that that's still correct. And you could mess around with the font size as you are working with your proof of concept test. And then in addition to the buttons, there could be other invisible items that might pop up and that you might want to correct for. So with Applitools, I consider it decisions made easy, meaning you can easily just go in and say, yeah, that was right, or no, that was wrong. And what we're talking about here for anyone that's new to Applitools is we're sending the rendered context of our application to the Applitool servers so that the Applitool servers can look at that and say, I had this thing that I know is the home page. Is that still valid? And when the new image comes, they're going to look at them and it's going to analyze it. It's going to do some cool logic that I don't understand, but I don't have to. It's a layer of abstraction that we are paying for as a service. And when it looks at that, it can tell me whether or not it's accurate or not. And if it's inaccurate, it can give me some actions that I can make. I can say that is an expected change or an unexpected change. And just as easily as you can like or dislike your friend's posts on Facebook, you can make decisions within the tool. So that's kind of the high level of the tool. And we use it all the time with the mobile app. Considering our mobile app is member facing, there's a lot of parts of it I can't show it in a public forum at this particular time, but we can look at another aspect of Apply Tools. So I have my mobile app, it's on my device, the testing device, maybe it's in the lab, maybe it's sitting next to me, I'm running it, and that's great. But what about growth? Where can we go from there? Well, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this amazing new product called the ultra-fast grid. And I think back to good old tool time on home improvement. Just need more power. And that's what this provides to us. It provides an immense amount of power to our tests. So we have this amazing ultra-fast grid that's rocketing out there. And I'll talk about it a little bit. I thought we'd have this fun visual throwback to the 80s, 90s image of the way in which it works. So our tests run in a browser, and our driver could be Selenium, could be Cypress, could be anything that you want that there's an SDK available for. And I think last I checked, there's 15, 20 SDKs available. So go take a gander and see. We can do something neat. We can say, well, instead of just testing my browser right here, I want to say, given this browser, I want to test against the grid. And what does that mean? That means that the DOM and its assets are packaged up for each page that we visit, and we say check, and it's sent off to the grid. And in the grid are a plethora of different browsers that can be fired up in, I think, nearly any screen resolution so that we can test various responsive things. And those are just set there waiting for us to receive that HTML DOM, that packaged web page, and to open it up in whatever browser we ask for and whatever viewport we ask for, and it's rendered in that browser. And there's a couple of really magical things that happen there. One of which is we saved a whole lot of network traffic. I didn't have to maintain an entire mess of browsers with different viewports to fire these things up and then to test them against. And I also didn't have to, just wait for the time. So there's a couple of really great use cases for this that I'd like to talk about. And some of the use cases we used the ultra-fast grid for is UI library changes. So if we're switching to Angular from another framework, and you hear that, oh, it's not going to change anything, we'll just swap it out, swap some bits out, and all of a sudden the site's going to render wonderfully. Well, how do we know? That's a lot of testing to do. Couldn't we ship that off to something more appropriate for the testing? And in our case, Apply Tools is that something more appropriate. Frequently, you'll have CSS changes. And again, it's like, well, I tested where I think it was. Maybe they don't know. Maybe the development team and those they're making the changes aren't fully aware. And why should they be wasting the time on that? So let's just give them a better capability, a better way to do it. So we can use ultra-fast grid for that. Maybe you're making some content management system changes. Maybe you are upgrading, taking a new version. You're like a little paranoid about that. You can use the grid for that. Maybe you're switching systems. Well, I would be really paranoid from that. So, let's solve that paranoia by leveraging on a tool that we can use for that. And then time crunches. We hear a lot in this, even in this conference, about, well, how do you get to all the things? How do you test all the things? And I too am not a proponent of you must automate everything all the time, but I certainly am a person that likes to aim for adding efficiencies to the testing process. How do we add efficiencies to the testing process? Through various forms of innovation. And for this particular, we're leveraging the innovation that came from Apply Tools. So enough chat. I want to get into a demo. And let's make sure that I can get into that and see. So before we do that, I want to just show how this test was done. So to strip away all the technical bits from running one of these tests so that it's in a form that anyone can run, I decided to use a Selenium IDE. Selenium IDE, for those who don't know, is back. It is sponsored by Apply Tools. Thank you. It is a kind of a handy tool to have. In this case, I ran the Selenium IDE in Chrome. I did a little bit of a recording and a little bit of inserting of things, especially for when we have some waits of, let's make sure the page is done being rendered. So you have the Selenium IDE, and then in addition to that, there's the Apply Tools for Selenium IDE plugin. Now this plugin, for my case, is connected to our Apply Tools instance for independent health, And there's some really sweet things you can do. Just say execute against the grid, super duper easy. In my case, I selected a few browsers. It's hard to read. I selected Chrome, Firefox, Safari, and Chromium Edge. And then I chose 2 viewport sizes. I figured like little netbook style and nice desktop, a 1080 and a 720 style display. And then devices. Now, one thing, these are Chrome emulations. So, when you go into Chrome and you select developer options, you say, emulate browser, and it shrinks it down. You got a bunch of browsers, or not browser devices to choose from. That's what this is doing here. But from a rendering perspective, to say, I know the iPhone X is of a certain size, and I want to make sure that, our responsive website is rendering there properly. When they open up, like here, I have a contact form. Is that contact form fitting on the screen? Is it blowing out? What is doing? And that's something that that you can do here. And in this case, I just chose portrait mode, but you can certainly go in and choose landscape mode as well. So that's the setup of my test. So we're not just staring at a test running. I've already run this a bunch of time, and I would like to take a look at some of those results. So when you run against any Applitools test, you have the ability to look at this dashboard. And when you use the grid, this dashboard is kind of exciting because that simple test that I put together that I think was, I don't know, what was it, just 5 or 6 checkpoints, if that, ended up turning into a plethora of checkpoints. It ran against Firefox, Safari, Edge, Chromium. It ran on Mac OS for Safari. It ran on Windows for Chromium Edge. And then for, I believe, all the all the Firefox and Chrome stuff that runs on Linux. For devices, we had a whole bunch of desktop, obviously. And then we had some emulated. We had iPhone X emulated, XS emulated, and Galaxy S5. And we can look at the viewports. I didn't assign any tests out, but we get a really nice dashboard here. And this one here, to me, is the most important, the checkpoints. How many matched? If we had any mismatches, they would show up in red, or they would show up in yellow, because it's waiting for our decision. A mismatch doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely wrong. It means it needs somebody to take a gander at it. Maybe it's an intended change. And then anything new. In this case, I added some new stuff. So let's look at 2 areas. Area number 1, let's look in the batch details for a pass. And I'm going to pull up first one of the edge. As you can see, we have a capture, a full DOM capture, so the entire bottom of the page, not just the above the fold. And we can zoom in and we can look at this and we can see what are we looking at. Here is our baseline, and here on the other side is what was captured during the test. And in this case, I was illustrating that menu test, where you hover over the menu and the menu drops down. You want to make sure that menu that drops down is rendered accurately. Because if a person can't interact with something, your Selenium WebDriver or whatever your automation tool of choice can interact with it because it has access to the full DOM. If a user can't interact with it, then you're going to get phone calls up the wazoo for your support center. And we can go through here and we can see any of the other pictures that were taken by the tool and compared and validated. You can also look at the same thing on a much smaller device. So this is representing the iPhone XS, just a slightly different viewport. So we'll just pick on 2 things. We have the contact form, how it opened up in the Edge browser, and how it opened up in, let me zoom in a little bit, how it opened up on the iPhone XS. So we can certainly see how it rendered. We can see that it didn't blow out. It did shrink down appropriately for the responsive web, and it did a nice job. So it helped us both ensure that on a smaller footprint, our contact form is able to be filled in and that it's going to look well. The first time you run your tests, you do have to go through and you have to give a good old thumbs up to most of the images just to say that, yes, I approve these images. I want these images to be used as our baseline. Now what happens when something doesn't work out well? Let's hope I pick a good test. So there's some really wonderful techniques that you had. And let's just pick something of the desktop level so I don't have to squint. So Safari in like a smaller form, that would work out for me. So we're going to zoom in and we can see that we have some dynamic content here. So here's a good example. I was hoping for a better one, so I want to find a better one, something slightly more fun. Here we go. Now we have a lot of content. In this case, we had so much content that actually the menu looks like it shifted. So we're not going to pay attention to the menu at this juncture. I want to look at this here. Most of your websites are probably going to have some form of dynamic content, whether that content is items that are spotlight ads that are changing, whether they're paid advertisements or whatnot. We can easily go in and we can select a block, and I can say, I don't want to ignore the region because I want something to be there. Well, in this case, I could say I want it to just be an area that stores content. And it's going to do a check. Whoop, I didn't mean content. People at Apply are probably going to yell at me. I think I wanted to choose layout. And there is a little bit that I have to shrink down. But we can tell it to treat different areas in a very specific way. And if you're thinking about other areas such as, well, I have this thing and it's going to have different heights. I don't have an example of one of those right now, but what you can do is say, here's a zone of where that thing might float around. And then within the zone, tell it what's there. And as long as that thing is within there, it's going to find it just fine. So I do want to be cognizant of time. So I do want to wrap up this demo and go into some closing thoughts on the ApplyTools solution that we have. Oh, I put some screenshots in here in case the demo didn't work. So let's jump ahead those screenshots into the wrap up. So for us, what does ApplyTools do for us as a whole? So we get speedy results to be able to even execute doing all of those checks. Even if we wrote the automation, might take a little bit of time. And especially if and whenever we use the ultra-fast grid, the execution time, like the execution time for that test back there, I think was under 3 minutes. So under 3 minutes is pretty darn good for the quantity of devices and browsers that we had that run against. And again, do remember, these are emulated devices for the phones, but especially when you're dealing with viewports, that's incredibly beneficial still. It's worry-free in the sense that things are going to change. You're going to have an application that might be under rapid development, and they just have this very lofty roadmap. We can respond to change very easily. If we can make every bit of testing as simple as saying, yeah, I approve of that change with a thumb up or a thumb down button, that's just awesome. It's flexible. It's incredibly flexible, and both in terms of what you can test with it, because you can technically test any rendered content. If you want to test a form of a PDF, you can do that. If you want to test a desktop application, have at it. You can send pretty much anything there. It's also flexible in terms of choices. You can go out and look at the different SDKs available. You definitely have choices in what tooling and what language you get to use. As I've shown a couple of times, the decision making is super easy. And frequently I get a lot of questions on how do you really know the automation is doing those things? And the pictures that are captured with ApplyTools are just worth an immense amount when it comes to working with the business. It's just phenomenal. So I'd like to close up. So sure, a lot of folks want to, finish up their day. I do appreciate the time today. Certainly feel free to reach out if there's any questions. And I do want to give a big shout out and thank you for ApplyTools for sponsoring this conference, as well as their contributions with Eyes in the Ultra-Fast Grid. But absolutely, the effort that goes into Test Automation University is wonderful, and the new automation cookbook stuff that Angie's going to be talking about, and you'll see her just promoting, is just great.